Okay, good morning, everyone. This is David Gauci. Greetings from the coast of Maine. On behalf of Dave Nagel and me, we welcome you to the third talk in the Business and Energy series. As always, you may find information about our talks and archives of previous talks on our website, www.forum2100.org. Our talks are designed to be interesting, provocative, and efficient, only 30 minutes in duration. We encourage you to engage the speaker with questions. Just to remind you of our format, it goes as follows. Our guest will present for 18 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers that I shall moderate. And please send your questions using the chat utility in Zoom. We shall conclude with a minute of information about our forthcoming talks. So today we are honored to have Anna Demeo of Racepoint Energy with us to address the topic of smart microgrids. Please review Anna's biographical sketch on our website. She has an interesting career that has straddled the academic and business communities and has experience in community energy in both Europe and the United States. Among other things, she serves now as the Director of R&D for Racepoint Energy. Well, welcome to Forum 2100, Anna. You have attracted an audience spanning more than 10 time zones. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Get rid of that.
I'm not sure either. Let's see if we can figure that out. Thank you and hello everyone. Just gonna see if I can move the pointer here. Great. Well, we'll make it work. So I'm here to talk today about the changing electricity grid and specifically about Racepoint Energy's microgrids for homes, businesses, and communities. Electricity is really an exciting space to be in right now. The grid is in the process of an unprecedented transformation, and there's several drivers that are motivating this. So I'm going to start today to talk about those motivations for change, and then we're going to do a brief Grid 101 just so that we're all on the same page before I dive into Racepoint Energy in particular. Okay. So it's often said that electricity is like air, that we don't think about it until it's gone. This is the 2003 blackout that impacted much of the northeast of the US and parts of Canada. And it was really the wake-up call to start thinking seriously about updating the North American electricity grid. So we're dealing with aging infrastructure, an increased electricity demand, and more frequent and severe storms that equate to more power outages. And this really comes down to safety and security as one of the driving motivators. And as you can imagine, there's financial implications to this as well. And that brings us to our second motivator, which is economics. So we have an increased cost of delivering power, which results in rising prices. We have a decrease in renewable generation as well as a decrease in the cost of batteries. There's advances in smart technology. There's also regulatory requirements and incentives that are really forcing utilities to change how they think about producing and delivering power in a feasible economic way. And the third motivator comes down to environmental stewardship. So the electricity sector is responsible for over 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And this is a fact that we just have to grapple with, and many states are implementing regulations and incentives to start with deal with that. So that would be our third motivator. So let's talk a little bit about the electricity grid. So you have really three sections. You have your generation, and then you have your transmission and distribution, and then you have your end users, your consumers. And this is basically the same grid that's been in place for over 100 years, ever since the end of the current wars between Westinghouse and Thomas Edison, where you have a central generating plant and then power sent long distances to end users and consumers. So obviously there's been some improvements around some of the infrastructure, being able to send power longer distances at higher voltages, but basically it's the same. And it works on a model of generation following demand. And this is key when we think about the grid. So what this means is that we all use generation as much as we need. We all use power as much as we need, anytime we need it. And utilities have to ramp up and down generation to meet that demand. When you think about how many of us there are now from when we started and how much power we use, that is a huge task to really try to meet that demand. Utilities are, do we have a,
yeah.
should I pause?
Just pause for a second.
Sorry, everybody.
And what we're going to try to do is new share. And this is where you move this over here.
We need to start again.
I'm not sure. You do the play.
No, there you go.
There.
Well, if I could hear all of you, I'd ask for feedback if we should start again or not. What do you think?
I think you go ahead and start again.
Start again?
Yep, and we'll just attenuate the questions.
For those of you who have already seen this, you're going to get a repeat showing. So I'm going to go back. My apologies. They've already heard it, but they're not going to see it.
Yeah, so you can go faster.
I'll go faster and see if I can switch it up a bit for you all. Okay, so we're talking about electricity today, and specifically about Racepoint Energy and the microgrids for homes and businesses and communities. And so I was saying that electricity is a really exciting space to be in right now because of the transformation of the grid. And there's several drivers that are motivating that transformation. So I'm starting with talking about those motivators and then doing a really quick grid 101 in order to have us all on the same page before we get into Racepoint Energy's solutions and offerings. Okay, so we talked about, it's funny to repeat this, so all of you who've heard it, but electricity is often referred to, or often equated to air in that you don't really think about it until it's gone. And this is the 2003 blackout that impacted much of the Northeast and parts of Canada, and was the wake-up call to really get serious about updating a very aging infrastructure across the grid. We have an increased electricity demand and more frequent and severe storms, which are equating to more power outages, not just in terms of the number of power outages, but the duration of those outages, which is super impactful in terms of safety and security, and has huge financial implications as well, which is our second motivation. So we have lower prices for renewable generation and decreased costs for batteries. There's advancement in smart grid technology. There's also an increased cost to providing and delivering power from utilities, which is resulting or translating into rising prices for consumers. And then the regulatory requirements and incentives that are really forcing utilities to rethink how they do their business. So that's the economics piece of it. Then the third and final motivator is around climate change and environmental stewardship. The electricity sector accounts for over 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and this is a fact that we all have to grapple with. And states are really taking the lead right now, at least in the US, for mandating changes to address this issue. So now we're talking briefly, this is our Grid 101, just to go over it again. The grid is really broken into three sections. So you have your generation, then your transmission and distribution, and then your end users, your consumers. And the way this looks is you have a central generation plant, and then power is sent long distances at high voltages to the end users, to the consumers. This is basically the same grid that's been in place since the end of the current wars between Westinghouse and Tesla. Westinghouse, Tesla with Edison. Although there's been improvements, the model of the grid is very much the same. And that foundation, what's important, is the model of generation following demand. Okay, and this is what's really important to think about as we look to the future. So the way it works is that we all use as much power as we want whenever we want it. And utilities have to ramp up and down generation to meet that demand. And that's a huge task when you think about how much our population has grown and our need for energy over the last several decades. Fortunately, utilities are very good at tracking demand. They follow demand across sectors, across different industries, time of year, day of the week, time of day. So they're really good at this because by law, they're required to keep enough generation on hand to meet demand at any given time. So let's go through an example here. So if a utility is servicing a residential area, we in societies tend to operate in fairly similar modes. So on a weekday, we'll all get up, sometime in the morning, 6 or 7 there, and use electricity to make our coffee and toast our toast before we head out to school or work or whatnot for the day. And then there's a dip. And then we come back again in the evening and we use power much more power for about 3 or 4 hours before there is another dip at the end. So what this means for utilities is they have to keep the infrastructure in place that is large enough wires, big enough generation to meet that peak demand that we only really use for 3 or 4 hours in a day. And that can get quite costly. And you can imagine if they could shave off those peaks even a little bit and reduce what they need to have at any given time, there would be some serious financial savings for them and some more stability for our grid. Another thing that utilities are grappling with is increased penetration of renewables into the grid. So the US was slow to catch on to industrial scale wind and solar compared to other parts of the world, but we're on track now, and it's really changing the way utilities can address their generation portfolio. They don't have the same level of control as they did over traditional power plants, and this is something that is forcing us all to rethink how the grid is structured. And that brings us to a paradigm shift from that generation following demand model to a model of demand following generation. So in the case of areas of the grid that have a high penetration of renewable energy, we now have to track that generation and then manage the demand in order to match it. So if you're in Texas and in the evening, there's a large wind farm that has an excess of wind energy, we want to be able to ramp up demand to match that generation. And conversely, if there is a lull in generation, a quiet, still day, we want to be able to reduce the demand to match that generation. This ability to shift our demand up and down has huge implications as well for those peaks I was talking about on the residential slide a little while ago, which is that if we could manage our demand and shift up and down such that we can peak shave off of those, that has a lot of positive effects for the grid as a whole on all of the fronts, on the ability to reduce the amount of generation, therefore impacting both climate and financials, as also make a more robust, reliable grid that helps with the safety and security issues around the motivations for change. So this shift on the macro level is also reflected on the micro level for consumers. And interestingly, those same 3 drivers are at play. So people are concerned about security and safety given this increased number of power outages. I've worked with people in Florida and Texas impacted by hurricanes without power for days or sometimes weeks. People in the northeast of the US impacted by blizzards, and on the west by wildfires. And so there's this real concern over safety and security personally. And certainly for businesses, there is that financial impact of lost revenue when the grid is out. So that brings us to the second incentive, which is around financial savings. So you have a decreased cost in solar and storage, you have an increasing cost in electricity, and you also have some financial savings in the form of state incentives and rebates. And then the last but not least is the environmental stewardship component. And this can be either driven by personal value system or state mandated, as is the example in California around requirements for solar for all new residences. Okay, so that brings us to Racepoint Energy and the Racepoint Energy solution. Before I get into the solution, I'd like to talk briefly about the company itself. A small group of people started Racepoint Energy, and they have their roots really in telecom and in building automation. So the founder of Racepoint Energy founded a company called Excel Switching back in 1988, and he sold it to Lucent in 99. And there's a lot of parallels between telecom in the 80s and 90s and the energy sector today. They're both regulated markets and require a high level of reliability and redundancy in order to participate. Technology was a disruptor to the telecom industry in that time, forcing these large legacy companies to either reinvent themselves or to perish. Technology also brought telecom from the shadows into the forefront of public awareness and participation, and all of that is very much true for what's happening in energy right now. In 2005, SAVANT was founded, and that's a high-end home automation company. Now there's currently over 100 employees with distribution globally. And so the SAVANT platform allows both residential and corporate clients to do full building control, right? Whether that be climate, lighting and shades, security. And so it was a natural segue to go from this idea of building control to energy control. And a couple of years ago, Racepoint Energy was founded as a sister company to SAVANT to do complete microgrid solutions for both homeowners, businesses, as well as communities. Okay, so you've all gotten through all that part. We can actually talk about what Racepoint Energy does now that you're all well educated. So Racepoint Energy offers both a nanogrid solution for residents, for homeowners, and a microgrid solution for the commercial sector and for communities. And there's three physical components to the system. You have your solar, your battery and microgrid forming inverters, and then your dynamic load management system. But really what makes RPE distinct from other systems is this full monitoring and control that changes it from a piecemeal system. Today, a lot of people are trying to kludge together components and make a grid work. But what RPE does is we have a full system control to really create your own grid when the need arises. So let's walk through how that works. So being that we are a sister company to SAVANT, our first natural market was to work in the luxury home space. And really, RPE nanogrids work mostly for homes that are 5,000 square feet or more. This is a 20,000 square foot house on the coast in Massachusetts. You'll notice that there is, they do have solar panels, but as most of you know, those solar panels won't work when the grid goes down due to anti-islanding laws and to keep line workers safe. So what happens in a home like this is normally there's a backup generator. Now that generator normally isn't big enough to service the whole house. What's typically done is that you have a critical load panel. So you have a fixed number of what they call critical loads. And this might be your refrigeration, maybe a well pump, some lighting, a socket or two. And these are fixed. So it doesn't matter if it's winter or summer or night or day. That's what you get to run off when the grid goes down. And you could add batteries and some islanding inverters. And this helps. If you have the right level of control, then you can utilize some of your solar during the daytime and then some of the battery and generator at night. But you're still limited to that critical load panel. So what RPE does is it frees you from the critical load panel. We have what's called RPE companion breakers. And these are fully controllable breakers that fit into a regular standard electrical box. And so what that does is it makes every single breaker in your house able to be a critical load. So you can prioritize loads based on time of day, time of year, or even where you are in your house at that given time. And so by this, we have freed the user from a critical load panel to be able to use full functionality of their house and really create their own grid. So this is where that systems level software comes in that manages the whole grid. So we can look at all of the different inputs into the system: solar, the electricity grid, battery, and a generator if you have it. And those are all your inputs. And then all of the loads that we can look at on a breaker-to-breaker level, as well as managing control of all of the different loads. And through that, we can optimize the system. So one way to control the loads, as I mentioned, is through breakers, but we can also do it through lighting control, through temperature control, through hot water heaters and pool heaters and smart appliances. And there's two modes of operation, right? So there's the grid failure mode, which we've talked about quite a bit now. Your grid goes down and the RPE nanogrid takes over and makes a seamless transition so that you're not lacking power at any given time to the full extent of your system. But really what's more common is that the power is up, that we do have a grid. And so in this case, in the normal operation, the software takes into account the batteries and what sort of dynamic load management is available and meshes that with time of use pricing in order to optimize your system and get you the most financial savings as possible. So that is the overview of the nanogrid, and then the microgrid is just a bigger system to service businesses, hotels and resorts, and communities. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the financials. because this is, again, one of the main themes in adopting these grids. So for the US at least, we have a very different, a wide range of incentives vary by state. And so net metering rules vary by state, solar and battery incentives, and environmental standards. What this does, it makes some areas like California, New York, Massachusetts, very appealing for this work because the financials pay off very quickly. In other places, the financials don't pay off, but if your driving factor is security and safety, say you're down in Texas and that's imperative and the financials don't matter as much to you, or if you're somebody who's really concerned about environmental and are driven by wanting to be fossil fuel free and the financials don't matter as much, that's another driving force. So it's kind of those three buckets for us. There are some incentives on the federal level. So we have the federal investment tax credit, which is 30% tax credit up until 2020, and then it starts to decline. There's also a rapid depreciation for businesses that they can take over 6 years. There's also two relatively new incentives, not really incentives, they're more orders from FERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that oversees wholesale prices in the US. And they have passed two recent orders, 745 and 841. And what these do is they require that both demand response, which is the manipulation of loads, demand side management, and storage both be allowed to participate in energy markets. And this really could be game changing as far as the financial piece of this is concerned going forward. So if you think about microgrids for hotels or multi-dwelling units, or even for communities, when you think about being able to manage demand across hundreds of rooms or across hundreds of homes and be able to utilize that demand response in the energy market, you've created a revenue stream that really changes the game when it comes to the financials. I've worked with several hotels and resorts who've been impacted by grid outages. So they've lost a ton of revenue because they've been out for 1, 2, or 3 days. And so that's what's driven them to invest in a microgrid and invest in a large battery system. But really, they only need that battery system when the grid is down. So this has turned into a win-win for both the hotel as well as the utility under these new FERC rulings. Because what it means is that battery source, it can be utilized by the utility as a generation source. And that creates a stream of revenue for the hotel to help pay back a system that they already felt compelled to buy anyway. So there's a lot of hope and exciting financial opportunities going forward in this space. And I think, given that, I think I'm going to wrap up and take any questions you might have.
Great. Anna, thank you very much. Very interesting as always. Let me start with a question. You alluded to this a little bit in the talk, but are these approaches that you're espousing better suited for communities with high rates of electricity growth? So do you see slow overall electricity growth presenting any obstacles for adopting the approaches you have illustrated in your talk?
Sure. Is my audio on here?
Yes.
So thanks for that. So certainly if you have high electricity prices, that is going to help the financials work out much quicker. And that is why I think a lot of the work I have done is started on island communities, which traditionally have higher electricity rates. And so we've seen that with renewables and with batteries, that it's a blessing and a curse. Yes, I have high electricity rates, but wow, this solar and this battery solution really makes sense for me. Again, keep in mind that there's really these three motivators. So if your motivation is purely financial, the higher price you pay for electricity or the more you use is going to be the driving force. But I've seen a lot of both individuals and businesses whose driving force is about safety and security or is about the environment. And in those cases, not as much.
You also talked about 3 buckets, as I recall, and interested to know if your applications work best really in large-scale applications, larger homes, and also in warmer climates like the south of France or California than in, say, a northern clime.
Yeah. So certainly because the battery technology we have adopted is from an industrial level that we've scaled down to residential, as opposed to trying to start with some of these small 7 kW systems and grow them up, which have a whole bunch of problems technically. And because we've done that industrial down, we're limited to the size, and really 5,000 square foot homes are the smallest that make sense. Certainly, if you're in a place that has a high air conditioning demand, that really impacts the overall use
conference call in New York. Can I call you back?
Electricity and the viability of the system. So yes, the paybacks look better if either you're in the south using a lot of AC, or you're anywhere in the world and you've decided to convert completely to electricity. So you're no longer heating your home with gas or oil, but decided to using heat pumps and electricity. That changes as well.
So in a lot of different kind of question, and a lot of places, rural environments in particular, people commonly have backup generators because the electricity grid goes down occasionally because of climate or weather events or whatever. And a question here would be whether or not what you're proposing here presents additional ways to deploy, say, a backup generator to manage an electricity bill, especially when you're running the generator on something like propane, and you can compare the price of propane with the price of electricity conveyed over the grid.
So certainly we can incorporate a generator into RPE microgrid or nanogrid, and there's benefits to doing that, and there's drawbacks to doing that. So there's the ability to get fossil fuel, the cost of fossil fuel, and also the noise associated with the generator. I haven't seen any application where we'd want to use the generator to, say, offset cost for time of use for electricity. Really, batteries are so much better suited for that. They don't need a fuel source, they're quiet, and they're there because they need to be there for the grid forming mechanism in order to allow your solar panels to work when the grid goes down. But certainly we can incorporate a generator, and because of the dynamic load management system, those generators just add to the ability to manage all of the demand, all of the loads in your house, and not just your critical load panel.
Okay. And one final question. Could you please go back over this issue about the payback period? So what is it for customers who adopt the kinds of applications that you are proposing here? How long would they have to wait before they actually would see some sort of return?
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about California, because California right now is the best place for us to get the best payback. So in California, with the incentives that are there and the cost of solar, to do a full microgrid, let's say working on a microgrid that has a community of 5 homes, so it's 5 separate microgrids working together, and the paybacks there are anywhere from 6 to 9 years, and that's taking into account the SCHIP program in California,
Too long.
and the macros depreciation, as well as the ITC tax credit. This is not taking into account the FERC rulings that I mentioned for storage and for demand response, and as those get worked out, I think we're looking at better return on investments for across the country.
Okay. Well, Anna, thank you very much for your presentation and your response to the questions. In the interest of time, I think we'll have to leave it at that for the moment. But for all of you listening, you can send any other questions you might have to Anna to her email, which is there on the slide, anna.demeo@racepointenergy.com. You may also find the archived talk from today posted on our website, www.forum2100.org, within 24 hours. And now here is some information on our next 2 talks. On Wednesday, the 27th of June at 11:30 New York time, Anna Turbovich, co-founder of Grid Singularity in Berlin, Germany, will address blockchain applications in energy. And then on Wednesday, the 26th of September, Nick Gogerty, co-founder of SolarCoin, will talk about cryptocurrencies to encourage solar energy adoption and use around the world. You can find out more about these talks and all about Forum 2100 on our website. We thank all of you in the audience for your attention and your questions. Please do let others know about the Business and Energy Talks. We look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday, the 27th of June, with Anna Turbovich of Grid Singularity. Until then, our best wishes to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.